Well, thank you for making it for us.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm excited to be here.
All right, so it's time. Iilise, are you ready?
I am, and it looks like there's maybe Asma entered the waiting room.
I accepted her, but for some reason it's joining. She's been joining for a minute now.
Okay, great.
But I admitted her in. Okay, so thank you, Iilise Cohen, for making it. So this is a lecture with you, followed by a Q&A organized by the Palestinian Dialogue Group. So Dr. Iilise Cohen is a US academic scholar, writer, and activist, and a PhD in social and cultural anthropology. And we're going to discuss the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism and the legal fight to stop it. So Iilise, the floor is yours, and it will be followed by Q&A.
Sounds great. And how much time overall do we have, just so I have an idea?
We're looking at 1 hour, if possible.
Okay, sounds great. So hi, it's good to be here with all of you. So what I'd love to do initially, just because I'm not sure where people are coming from, is maybe to talk about what the IHRA definition is. And if there's anything that comes up where I'm going too slow, or there's more information you want, or you're in a different place, just let me know. It's actually helpful for me to know. I'm going to share my screen and show so IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Definition, working definition of anti-Semitism, is a definition that was put together as a way to respond to the rising anti-Semitism in Europe around 2000. And it says in this document, as you can see, it says the working definition, and this is important to remember, the working definition of anti-Semitism. It was in the spirit of the Stockholm Declaration. It was also in the context of anti-Semitism and xenophobia and responding to that as a whole in Europe. And then eventually the committee came together and put together, because of Holocaust denial and the rising anti-Semitism, put together a plenary in Budapest in 2015 and adopted this working definition. As you can also see, it says a non-legally binding working definition of anti-Semitism. So still in the works, something that they were trying to do to address, and there were many things that were happening in Europe where Jews were being targeted in synagogues and in different places that were identified as Jewish. So to guide this work, they talked about how, so the definition itself, anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews, which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. So when you look at the definition itself, there's not a whole lot that it says other than, if anti-Semitism is directed at Jews or people who are perceived as Jews, to their property, to the individuals, to institutions, to religious facilities. Now, the one part that comes up is rhetorical and physical manifestations, which we can take a little time to talk about that. Rhetorical meaning that it's the kinds of ways that you speak about Jewish people, and physical manifestations, of course, the actual acts of hatred, which are much more clear. So why would we have rhetorical in there, or why would rhetorical be in there, is one of the questions. So then IHRA, in order to kind of discuss And I'm not somebody who works for IHRA. I'm just kind of trying to lay out the groundwork here. So IHRA talks about there needs to be some examples in order to illustrate what they're talking about. So manifestations might include the targeting of the state of Israel, conceived as a Jewish collectivity. However, criticism of Israel similar to that leveled of any other country cannot be regarded as anti-Semitic. Anti-Semitism frequently changes, charges that Jews were conspiring to harm humanity. It's often used to blame Jews for why things go wrong. It's expressed in speech, writing, visual forms and action, and employs sinister stereotypes and negative character traits. Contemporary examples of anti-Semitism in public life, the media, schools, workplace, religious sphere, taking into account the overall context, include but are not limited to. And so this is where we get into the territory of, okay, let's really get into the meat of what's happening. Calling for, aiding, or justifying the killing or harming of Jews in the name of a radical ideology or an extremist view of religion. We could look at this and we could say, okay, most people who are thinking about this are thinking in terms of Islamist radical ideology. However, if you are in the United States and North America and other places in Europe where you know that the white nationalist extremist view of religion is about returning Jewish people to the land of Israel in order for the Messiah to come back and all the Jews will die, that is also a part of it. But you have to be educated enough to know that that's actually another piece of what is being talked about. Making mendacious, dehumanizing, demonizing stereotypical allegations about Jews, such as the power of Jews as a collective, especially but not exclusively, the myth about a world Jewish conspiracy or Jews controlling the media, economy, government, and other societal institutions. Now, this is actually, historically, if you take the time going from Christendom in Europe, or you say Martin Luther in the heart of the 1500s in Europe, and the anti-Jewish religious sentiment that came out of those kinds of documents, or the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which talks about how Jews are controlling the whole operation of what's behind governments or what's behind overthrowing governments. If you talk about how instead of just talking about movements that actually are addressing issues of power, that you actually say, the Jews are the ones that are controlling it, rather than actually talking about all the various groups that are controlling it. So that one tries to address that. Accusing Jews as a people of being responsible for real or imagined wrongdoing committed by a single Jewish person or group, even for acts committed by non-Jews. So this is similar to, I know in the US context, and y'all could talk about it more in a context in Turkey, but and we can certainly talk about it in terms of Palestine. If one Palestinian does something, then all of a sudden all Palestinians are grouped in with that group. So that's actually how racism functions, in the same way it does for anti-Semitism or anti-Jewish sentiment. Denying the facts, scope, mechanisms, that gas chambers, or intentionality of the genocide of Jewish people at the hands of Nazi Germany and its supporters and accomplices during World War II. So that one's dealing directly with denial of the Holocaust and the various elements at targeting Jewish people and killing them. Accusing the Jews as a people or Israel as a state of inventing or exaggerating the Holocaust. Okay, that one should be self-explanatory. And when I think of this one, there have been many people who've been talking about this, but one of the scholars here, Norman Finkelstein, who for years has written about how like not taking away with the memory of the Holocaust and what the Holocaust actually has done to traumatize Jewish people, but also how it's been used as a vehicle. So I think even his, and it's been very important scholarly work, that even his kind of work could be incorporated in this as a way to target that. So I think there's lots of places where we can talk about how it affects free speech, and this is one of the reasons why there's such a fight against all of it. Accusing Jewish citizens of being more loyal to Israel or to the alleged priorities of Jews worldwide than to the interests of their own nations. So self-explanatory, whether or not you can actually be loyal to two different places, or whether or not you could target it as loyal to one. And I have plenty to say about this, but I'm going to keep going because the next two are really the key ones, in my opinion. denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination by claiming that the existence of the state of Israel is a racist endeavor. Okay, we are going to come back to this because this is significant. And it also, so not only does it determine, not only does it say, it couches it as Jewish people, the only self-determination that Jewish people have is a self-determination to Israel. And it's also saying that by claiming the existence of state of Israel as a racist endeavor, that, okay, of course, looking at the Nakba and Palestinian history in Palestine, that's by itself, this is contradictory because the state of Israel is a racist endeavor. And if you also take into consideration, for instance, my group of people, Sephardic Jews or Jews who come from the Middle East, the existence of the state of Israel is also a racist endeavor. It comes from a different perspective in some ways, but it still is part of the, so not only is there erasure of the Nakba and erasure of Palestinians and Palestinian history, this is also an erasure of other Jewish people. Applying double standards by requiring of Israel, a behavior not expected or demanded of any other democratic nation. Okay, so if y'all were talking right now and I asked you what you thought about this, I would hope that one of the things you would say is, that doesn't totally make sense because, first of all, you can call Israel a democratic nation if you totally forget that it actually has been occupying a people for 56 years, in addition to the fact that the issues have not been addressed in terms of the Nakba and the existence and how Israel was produced as a state. And then applying double standards, this is a way to kind of push that the human rights language where you say, why are people talking about Saudi Arabia, but they're only focused on Israel? And then when you say, but there's an occupation, and then some people say, well, then the occupation isn't actually a thing. It's actually Israel is going to control the territory. So all of this language around how Israel controls the territory or how history is understood is actually being fabricated in a particular way. And I don't think the intention of this document was to start that. It's the fact that the people who are pushing for this to be legally binding and codified as law are the ones who are using it as a vehicle to say, okay, now we're really going to crush down on free speech. We're going to crack down on how people talk about history. And I'll explain more of that in a minute. This last one, these last couple ones, using the symbols and images associated with classic anti-Semitism or the claims of Jews killing Jesus or blood libel to characterize Israel or Israelis, which I thought was interesting because I think what they meant was to characterize Jews or Jewish people. So this by itself should be a red flag of, are we talking about Jewish people or are we talking about Israelis? And I have yet to have anybody who actually explains that in a way that makes sense. Drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis. I'm going to give an example. Yesterday, a Palestinian colleague of mine came to talk to my 11th grade class in a Middle East class or a Southwest Asia and North Africa class, sharing his personal story. And one of the 11th graders said, it sounds like what the Nazis did to the Jews. And I could see him, an incredible scholar. And in that thing, he was like, we have to be very careful, which is true. We should be careful about different people's histories and not collapse things. That doesn't help the Palestinian cause. It doesn't help how we frame history. However, this feeling that you can't actually say something without also putting together a whole range of context is something that's happening as a result of this, I think, of this movement to push and codify this. But what he did say is he said, look, there are not gas chambers, there are not ovens that literally people are being put into. So you can't make that comparison. What comparison you can make is that people have been ghettoized, that there is an occupation, and then there's other ways that you can describe the occupation and the Nakba that really is important to focus on those characteristics rather than how the Nazis occupied and killed the Jewish people. And this last one, holding Jews collectively responsible for actions of the state of Israel. Now, is everything still okay?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, great. So holding Jews collectively responsible for actions of the state of Israel. Now, this is another one of those things where when I look at it as a solidarity activist on Palestine, I think, okay, so is this actually trying to address crushing the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, for instance, because it may not be, it's not holding every Jewish person responsible, but am I going to go to the Jewish Federations of North America or American Jewish Committee or other kinds of Jewish institutions that say that they are the sort of representative voice of Jewish people? Am I going to hold them responsible for actions of the state of Israel? Well, I will hold them responsible for the actions of the state of Israel as long as they are showing this absolute support and funding and relationship to the language around the state of Israel. So this is very hairy. It doesn't, it's not, this is why these are contemporary examples. This is why. So it was never intention to be legally binding. And even one of the lead drafters of this definition, Kenneth Stern, and I talked to him recently because of the struggle that we had in Atlanta, Georgia, in the US. And he said, by no means, he knows this is being used absolutely as a vehicle to codify it, absolutely as a vehicle to chill free speech, to make sure that there's not pro-Palestinian speech, to make sure that advocacy on Palestine is being crushed in a variety of ways, and to make sure that criticism of Israel is not actually taking place or that people are scared to do so. So, so this gives you a sense of, and then what, so now what's happening, I'm going to get out of this screen sharing. So what's happening now with the IHRA definition is that all over Europe and also all over North America, there are attempts by, like in the United States, there are attempts by different states to pass a law that puts this IHRA definition as the definition of anti-Semitism. If you look at our laws, we do not have laws about anti-Black racism. We do not have laws about xenophobia. We do not have laws about anti-Latinx. So no matter what, we don't have those laws. The only law that recently passed in Georgia, sadly, last year was a law that was basically against critical race theory. What the law says is that in grades, kindergarten through 12th grade, that you are not allowed to actually teach anything that talks about Georgia or the United States as structurally racist. That alone, if I could see your faces, I would hope all of you would be like, that is terrible. Oh my gosh. Yes, that is terrible. So this IHRA definition, or this move to define anti-Semitism, is another form of white nationalist, in my opinion, white nationalist racist ways to codify into law. Do not be critical of white people. Do not be critical of the United States. Do not be critical of nationalist movements. And then using Jewish people as a tool, but also having Jewish extremists also support this codification. Now, in Georgia, for instance, and this is one example. So, okay, I guess I'll get the overarching thing. One is there are tens and tens of groups I'm going to show you here. Let me share the screen. So there are many, many Jewish groups around the world, and this may or may, I'm talking to a Palestinian group. I'm talking about this on the Jewish perspective side because if we're having laws codifying what anti-Semitism is or what anti-Jewish oppression is, Jewish people should be able to weigh in on that. And when we see as Jewish people that we're actually, that part of our community is being used as a vehicle to suppress advocacy on Palestine, and many of us are advocates for Palestine, we're also saying, hell no, we are not going to do that. So this is an example of one of the things that we gave legislators. There were Jewish Georgians who actually put their names that said, we're Jewish Georgians. We know that anti-Semitism is dangerous, life-threatening, and growing. But this bill, trying to codify this is the idea that political criticism of a nation state is the same as hatred and violence against someone because they are Jewish has become a powerful tool in the hands of those who work to silence Palestinian voices. So you have individual Jews who are willing to put their names down. Now, to get people willing to put their names down, is also an issue, and I'll explain why. So a few years ago, so I got a PhD in anthropology. I was really excited to finally be teaching in university, and I did so for about 15 years. However, at my last place of work, where I worked for 5 years, I was the only Jewish studies professor. And I was focused on talking about Jewish representation, introduction to Judaism. And I also got to talk about engaged Judaism and a lot of human rights, civil rights issues. I got to talk about Palestine. To me, that was like the most exciting. I got to talk about Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews and how there's racism within the Jewish community. So I was teaching these classes, got great evaluations, and I have a meeting with the dean, and the dean explains to me that one of the Jewish organizations, American Jewish Committee, which is a national organization and also has an international component, they do a lot of advocacy on Israel, and they were actually one of the people who was behind codifying IHRA, who is now against this, who was behind putting together the definition for anti-Semitism for IHRA, is actually one of the key people who's fighting against codifying it as a legal code. So the dean of the university brought me in and said they were no longer going to have the Jewish studies classes, that my contract was not going to be renewed, and that they were getting calls from the American Jewish Committee about what I do outside of campus. And so she literally said, they are calling you anti-Israel, they're calling you anti-Semitic. And I said, I don't know who they are, and they are not part of this institution, so it's kind of irrelevant. But I no longer work at that institution as a result of this kind of language, because I do work on Palestinian advocacy, that somehow that makes me unable to continue to teach in a university level, teaching Jewish studies. So that, that's one example of the many, many, and I'm sure y'all have heard all over the world how people are being targeted. Palestinians are being targeted, non-Palestinians are being targeted, students are being targeted, faculty are being targeted. And then outside the university system, of course, there's people who are being targeted if they, in Georgia, for instance, in Texas, there was a law case, but in Georgia, they passed a law that said if you have a contract with the state and it's over $1,000, then you have to sign a document that says that you do not support the boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel. And then that went to court. It was unconstitutional, so they raised it to $100,000, which nobody's going to go to court over that, because there's not going to be a corporation that's going to. Anyway, it shows you the kinds of ways this is working. And even though IHRA wasn't being used at that moment, you can tell that they all build on one another. So going back to what I'm showing you here is these organizations oppose codifying IHRA. So now when you look at this, you're going to say, okay, these are American Jewish organizations. Many of them are Zionist organizations. Many of them are organizations who, have sort of a different, like the Jewish Labor Committee is, not necessarily focused on Palestine or Israel, or Jewish Council on Urban Affairs. But then you have other groups like Amenu or Hashomer Hatzair, World Movement. You have Independent Jewish Voices in Canada, which specifically on Palestine, and they've done amazing research putting together why IHRA should never be codified and what the impacts of it are. You have the New Israel Fund, which is an organization that actually funds a lot of progressive issues in Israel. However, depending on where you are in the US or in North America, they can be kind of where you want them to be or where you not want them to be. The Progressive Israel Network is a bunch of organizations, including J Street, which is a lobbying organization in the US that advocates for a two-state solution, but they're actually considered the mainstream. And then the Rabbinical Assembly, Trua, a rabbinical. So this is rabbis and cantors, Jewish leaders from around the country who actually are against codifying this law. The Union for Reform Judaism, that's the largest denomination of Jewish people in the United States who are against codifying this. So you have a whole range of, and of course, Jewish Force for Peace. And so you have a whole range of Jewish organizations that are saying, we do not support codifying this. We know it's literally about crushing free speech. And regardless of where people are, and again, I realize I'm talking to y'all as a Palestinian group, but I just want to give you the context. Even if people are not agreeing about where they are on Palestine or on Palestine-Israel, everybody is aware that this is being used as a vehicle and a tool, and that it has to be fought. Now, who's fighting it are usually the people who are more solidarity activists with Palestine. And then international Jewish organizations, which there are many, many, many from all over Europe, North America, South America, South Africa. So you can see, and then we were showing Georgia organizations that are against it, human rights. And so we were in a coalition of mostly people of color, but also people who were, in other forms of civil and human rights organizations. And some of the civil and human rights organizations would actually not join with us because they were scared that they were going to be called anti-Semitic. And because the relationships with the Jewish community are tender, for lack of a better word, some of them actually did not speak up, which was extremely disappointing. And in my opinion, part of the anti-Semitism. If people are not going to actually speak up about an anti-Semitism bill that actually is not about anti-Semitism, but about crushing free speech, because they are afraid of being called anti-Semitic, then that actually is anti-Semitism. You're actually assuming that Jews have a lot more power, and you're giving that power, and you're actually reinforcing that stereotype that you're afraid of Jewish people because you won't actually stand up for a critical moment. And then national and international organizations all across the world, which you can see, and those include. So I just wanted to give you a sense of, clearly there is much more support against, much more of a movement against codifying IHRA than there is for. So who is codifying IHRA? So the people who are trying to push codifying it are, so again, American Jewish Committee is one of the groups in the United States, the Federations of North America, which is actually more surprising to me than I think it should be. Hillel, which is the university campus network of the organized sort of Jewish campus network stuff, who are very right-wing. And many, many years ago, there was a movement to push Hillel. It's like one of the only way. It's kind of like having a, I don't know what the equivalent is of it, but it's basically like being able to have a synagogue and a religious community on campus for Jewish people. But it's in a framework of being very, very pro-Israel, very nationalistic. And then, so these organizations are actually trying to support this, along with Israeli American advocacy organizations. And so when you see the linking of these, if you're familiar with what the links are, you understand what's happening. Now, this is also aligned with the super white right-wing Christian movement and Christian Zionists, but also, for instance, in Georgia, it's aligned with an organization that is a very right-wing legislative organization that is producing lots of bills that are copycat bills. So for instance, they write one bill and they can kind of change the language of the bill in order to push forward bills all over the country. So one of the things that they used it for was BDS bills. So they literally created a bill and then all of a sudden spread it in states like wildfire. So all of a sudden, like 33 states were passing these BDS bills. And now this anti-Semitism bill has been taken up, where they're trying to, it's not working as easily as the copycat bill for BDS, but it is something where they've gotten it in different states, and now they're trying to get city resolutions or universities to pass it. So it's being used as a copycat. So one other thing I want to say before I open up for questions, which hopefully this gives some of the groundwork, and I can tell you more about what happened in Georgia, is that okay, I just lost my train of thought. Hold on. What was I going to say? Is that I will get there. Okay, maybe I won't. I can't remember. Okay, so maybe what I'll do is, okay, let me give you the background about Georgia. So what happened in Georgia is last year, this bill came up. The Council on American Islamic Relations, CARE, Jewish Voice for Peace, or a few of us as Jews here in Atlanta, and then Project South, which is an organization that primarily works with the Black community in Atlanta, especially like prison pipeline, all, trying to address issues of rights in our city. We all work together to basically push and make sure that this didn't pass. It was absolutely surprising to the Jewish and Christian folks who were trying to push it through to codify IHRA. Somehow we managed to make enough of a ruckus to say that there were Jewish people who didn't support it, that we knew it was against Palestinian rights, and it got tabled and didn't pass through. We are in a new legislative session, and then this legislative session, they brought it back almost exactly the same, and we had to work very hard to show that there was more support. And what was happening is, what we saw is legislators who are white and Christian are scared of being called anti-Semitic. The legislators who are people of color, who of course know what this is about, are more open to voting against it, or are more open to not voting at all, but are still knowing that there will be repercussions if they don't. So instead of all of these people allying together, so we just had to create a lot of chaos. We had to give lots of information. We had to show letters from different groups. We had to, kind of show the Jewish side of things, the Palestinian side of things, the combination of human rights. And then, so this is the thing I remembered. So the last thing that we started to do was do research about one of the main people who kind of created this bill to go into this right-wing legislative group, and it's being pushed by these right-wing elements. And when you go to his writing, his name is Mark Goldfeder. He's a rabbi, but he's also a lawyer. And he is the legal counsel for the Hillels, that organization that are on campuses. And one of the things that he wrote, so he said he wrote the model for the bill. And one of the articles he wrote in Washington Times, or Mishpacha, which means family, is he wrote about the Palestinian Nakba, and I testified to this. He wrote, the Palestinian Nakba is a foundational myth of forced displacement, demonstrably false. The entire story is a lie. It's a mythology. It's a blood libel and anti-Jewish information. That alone, that's literally the language from IHRA. So what he's doing is he's setting up that the Nakba is actually, no matter how you talk about the Nakba, that it will be considered anti-Semitic because of with the language of those examples. And so one of the strategies we had to use was say, if you were going to shove an anti-Semitism definition forward, we think it should be with a definition of anti-Black racism and everything else, which of course we knew they wouldn't do, but we at least had to raise it and say, why are you exceptionalizing Jewish people? That by itself is anti-Semitic. In addition to that being able to, and then the second thing was, he said, he denies that Palestinian citizens in Israel face discrimination. He writes that human rights organizations like Amnesty is anti-Semitic for reporting about Israeli apartheid, even though Israel's own human rights organization reports a regime of Jewish supremacy from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean. So that what he's actually doing is that part of the definition that I initially showed you about rhetoric, and this is how we know it's not about anti-Semitism, is that he literally in every one of these articles talks about how this particular rhetoric about this Nakba mythology, this particular rhetoric about Israeli apartheid, this particular rhetoric about, whatever it is, that it leads to violence against Jewish people. Now, there have been some people who've used that as an excuse for violence. Like even in the US, there's somebody who said, because of what Israel is doing, but that's going to happen no matter what. The anti-Semitism that we're most concerned about is, if you ask me as a Jewish person, is the white nationalist anti-Semitism that really is trying to kill people and go into synagogues and do that kind of harm. And again, none of the folks who are advocating against this bill want any kind of anti-Semitism bill. If there's going to be a bill, it should be against white nationalism. Okay, I'm going to stop talking because that was a lot, and I would love to hear y'all's questions.
So that wasn't a lot. It was actually very interesting. Thank you, Dr. Iilise Cohen, for coming, for giving us this lecture, and thank you also for the Palestinian Dialogue Group in Istanbul for making this possible. So we have 2 questions written for you. If anyone else has any questions, feel free to either write them down or to raise your hand. So first question by Mustafa. Could you give your comment on the weaponization of anti-Semitism, how it affects the Palestine rights movement, and also the importance of having Jewish activists fighting for Palestine?
Yeah, great question. So this weaponization, so this is it, right? The weaponization of anti-Semitism is by being able to say, like, instead of addressing the actual ways, I just had 2 Palestinian colleague friends reach out to me and say, do you think we could actually just have a workshop about what anti-Semitism is and anti-Jewish oppression? And I loved that they did that. There was a part of me that just thought, okay, maybe the silver lining here is if we can have those real kind of conversations in an authentic way, rather than, in the midst of this struggle, which makes it so much harder, that would be great. And so we first had to have conversations about what is being Semitic and Semitism. And I don't, from a perspective here, anti-Semitic, and I'll just, the little bit of the history is that anti-Semitism was actually coined in the late 1800s by William Marr in Germany as a way to specifically focus on Jewish people and saying that this is the anti-Jewish hatred. Now, there are many folks here who will say, like, but we're, many of us are Semitic, Palestinians are Semitic, Jewish people are Semitic. Yes, we all come from the Semitic languages which align us. So Amharic and Arabic and Hebrew and Aramaic historically, that those connect us as Semitic peoples. However, the term anti-Semitism, and it would be great if we shift that and we kind of say, that's not, we're going to use the language of anti-Jewish oppression or anti-Jewish violence, that would kind of set up a new framework to get out of this anti-Semitism piece. Okay, so the weaponization you're talking about, how this impacts the Palestinian rights and Palestinians is that, sorry, I heard the echoing for a second, is that you have, like I said earlier, there are many, many people, faculty and students who are being targeted. And I'll give an example. About 4 years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, there was we helped, Jewish Voice for Peace helped the young Democratic Socialists of America on the campus of Georgia Tech University, or Georgia Institute of Technology, put together a Palestine 101 event. And they invited all the students, but then they realized that the staff members of Hillel, that organization I was talking about, were trying to come in. And the YDSA people at Georgia Tech said, we don't want the staff people to come in. We want students to have this conversation. So it was totally open to students. Well, they ended up getting disciplined and in trouble because Hillel and other communities pushed a lawsuit onto the university saying that Jewish people were discriminated against, and it was created a hostile environment, and that they were not allowed to enter into this conversation. And that's actually not what happened. But what the university did as a result was agreed to adopt the IHRA resolution as a way to talk about what anti-Semitism is. So now on campus, you have students who want to organize around Palestine, and they have to be super cautious. So I was asked recently to come and speak about crimes against humanity in Palestine for the Muslim Student Association. Now, these are students that weren't there at the time that this whole experience happened at Georgia Tech. So I said to them, I do not want to be the one, like, I can speak about anything. I've already been, I don't have a contract with the university. I can't be targeted in another way right now. But as students, I want to make sure y'all don't get disciplined in a way that actually is dangerous for you. So I put them in touch with Palestine Legal, which is the legal organization here in the US that basically was created 10 years ago because of this reason. So how Palestinians are being targeted, how Palestinian advocates are being targeted in universities and campuses. And so, so they contacted Palestine Legal, and Palestine Legal told them what do they need to do in order to make sure that they can stay safe enough and like whatever, that they're protected legally if something should happen and something is brought against them. So we had this event, and it was great. They had a ton of people there. They recorded it. They actually had an article about what the event was like and talking about Palestinian history and what's happening with the ongoing Nakba and the really huge upticks of the violence of the occupation. And then Hillel wrote something in the newspaper that basically called them anti-Semitic. So they're kind of in a waiting period. Like, they don't know what's going to happen. They know that something could really make it difficult for them to talk about things on campus. They could get disciplined. They could have to go into lawsuits. And what the Young Democratic Socialists of America group said that they had to do is they were in a 2- and 3-year lawsuit while they were in university. And it was very stressful. They couldn't speak openly. And they didn't know what was going to happen with their education. They didn't know how they were going to be seen in the outside world. So this is some of the ways that it's being weaponized to make sure that people either won't talk, or if they do talk, that they're scared. Another colleague of mine or a friend of mine who actually is at the same university can't speak, has been giving testimonies, but will only do so anonymously because it can affect their future in terms of being able to get a job. And so if it's spread like this, if everybody's scared about, if you're tied to, one person can make a phone call and start to scare the place that you work, and then all of a sudden you don't have an opening to your form of work. And as people who are just graduating, that's their whole future you're talking about. And then I think the second part of your question about how this impacts the Palestinian, I also think it emboldens the Palestinian rights movement. It makes sure that people are actually more loud. So you have some people who are being silenced, and some people who are like, if we stick together and we keep talking about it and we don't allow that silencing to happen, that there's going to be more ways that we can change things. And then the last part of that, of the importance of having Jewish activists fighting for Palestine. I mean, I think in this case, truthfully, in Georgia, in the South, in working against this, I think if it had just been Palestinian activists who were fighting against it, it would have passed. And that is not saying that I think Palestinian voices are less valuable or less important. I'm just saying I live in a state that is very Christian and very white, and it's 50-50 in terms of Republicans and Democrats. And as I said, many of the Democrats are too scared to say things, or they want to make sure that they keep their jobs in the legislature. So, so I think it is really important. And even one of the Palestinian legislators said to me, she was like, get as many letters as you can from these organizations. Like, we have to have the Jewish voices in order to, so I'll tell you, I felt a lot of pressure as one of the 3 key Jewish people working on it, a lot of pressure that if this passed, it was going to be on us and that so many people would suffer. And one other thing I just wanted to say is the coalition also, like, when you're working in, I don't ever want to go on government. It is not something I enjoy. I don't like the idea of some of the times you have to work trying to create less harm than ending harm. And there are important legislators that are doing that all the time. But this idea of, if you have a pure notion of how you want to work on Palestine, there's not a way to do that in a legislature. There's not a way to do it, because you have to do all these negotiations. So there were some folks in Palestinian movement who said, in no way should we be highlighting that there are other Jewish organizations that are against codifying this, because we're giving a Zionist message. And, that was a complicated thing in our coalition, because I in no way am trying to push forward Zionist messages. And at the same time, I am a Jewish person, and other Jewish people are actually against codifying this for the right reason. Whether or not their politics absolutely align with me at this moment, I don't want it to pass as a law. So that's more of a complicated question, which I think is an important part of, what happens if you have Jewish people involved, who do you want to have involved, and how much are you willing to negotiate in a situation around legal issues?
Okay, thank you for your clear and thorough answers. So we have a question from Yusuf. So the concept that Arabs are inherently anti-Semitic and will kill all Jews is a very Zionist concept. Actually, I don't know if you know this. We Levantine Arabs, we call Jews our cousins, Wulad Amna. So many people even don't know that there used to be a Jewish neighborhood in Gaza up until the Nakba. So the question is, how can we save Judaism from Zionism?
Oh, I wish y'all would save Judaism from Zionism. I mean, I'm not sure who's going to do it, but yeah, that is a great question. So let me think about it in two parts. One is, okay, I'm gonna share a personal story first. So personal story is, I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia. My grandfather was a Sephardic rabbi, so he was born in what is now modern day Turkey. He ended up going to Cuba. He was in the Turkish army during the Mandate in Palestine, and then he came to Cuba, and he became the Sephardic rabbi of the synagogue in Havana, Cuba. And then he was brought to Atlanta as the rabbi for the Sephardic congregation or community in Atlanta in the 1930s. I grew up going to Jewish day school. I grew up learning in an Ashkenazi environment, so a European Jewish environment. And I was taught, I can't tell you the moment I learned it, but I learned that Israel was my home. It was absolutely clear. There was not even a question in my mind. And the time when that question became less of a question. So this is, how do we, and we were performing our Jewish rituals. We prayed every day, we studied the Torah, but that was also a part of our understanding. And I didn't understand the concept. We didn't talk about Zionism. We just talked about Israel. That was it. But the time that I understood that something was different was actually when I went to high school in Israel and the first Intifada began. And all of a sudden I started to ask questions of my Jewish teachers saying, who are the Arabs? Like, what's happening? And I'm sorry, all the language, just remember I was 17. Okay, so all the language was, who are the Arabs? Who are the Palestinians? What's happening here? And nobody would answer the question. And that, to me, never in my life, in my Jewish life, was I in a place where when I asked a question, the Jewish community was not engaged in trying to answer it different ways. The fact that I was met with silence gave me a sense of something is really wrong here, and I don't understand it, and I now feel confused and scared and whatever. And so I went back to university. It was also during the first Intifada, and while I was there, I took a human rights course where the Israeli human rights lawyer was actually talking about occupation and the Fourth Geneva Convention, and then used the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza as a case study. I would have never known. So that was the beginning of my delinking, right, of Judaism and Zionism. And then the other part about that is, you have, when I look at like the young Jewish people who are getting in touch with me and who I mentor, they are absolutely clear about where they stand on Palestine. Like, they are absolutely clear that Israel as a state is a racist endeavor. They're absolutely clear that self-determination of one people crushing another is not okay. And they may fall politically in different places, but they also are up against their entire community. So one of the things that organizations like Jewish Voice for Peace has tried to do is kind of create an alternative, like Jewish universe politically and also spiritually. However, for someone like me, or someone who still wants to be part of my Jewish community, or be part of a synagogue, or be part of leadership, you can't it's hard to separate yourself out. It's like asking Muslims not to have a mosque, or Christians not to have or not to have a church to go to. It literally is it is turmoil to try and figure out how to delink that. But there are people that are doing it. There's a whole movement where like synagogues themselves are becoming less relevant for people who are younger or for people who are really politically engaged, especially on Palestine. So that's part of that question. And I think the other part of the question was that the main part of the question, or did I forget to answer something?
I think that's it. But Yusuf, if you have any additional comments, feel free to speak up or type up. So Muhammad Hadi is asking.
No,
so
I think that.
Go ahead. Okay, Tamir. So we have a growing number of Israelis, including Israeli officials, who are comparing Palestinians to Nazis. So do you have any idea why this is not being called out at all?
Oh, do I have any idea? Well, I guess I would start with the question, can I even fathom or understand or have any idea of how there is not absolute outrage by at least 98% of the American Jewish community about what's happening in Palestine. And even that, people are now jumping on like the judiciary is under attack in Israel. And there's like all these demonstrations, which is fantastic. But that's because what I would say is like equivalent of like white Christians here all of a sudden are losing their access to the judiciary. They're freaking out and they want something to change. But that doesn't mean they're actually trying to undermine like the very racist laws and the other kinds of things happening there. So I think that why isn't being called out? I don't know how to answer that question. I feel like it should be called out. I mean, I've always heard the opposite. Like I even heard it from family members of mine in Israel. They literally were saying we should act like the Nazis and decimate Palestinian populations. So that by itself is like, that hasn't been dealt with. And for Israeli government officials to actually, I mean, everything is actually to blame Palestinians or blame the outside rather than being accountable, right? That's usually how it works. So it's seriously problematic. And the irony, I mean, I think the irony is the IHRA definition tries to say that Israel can't be compared, or what the Israeli government does or practices can't be compared at all to Nazis, while at the same time, Israelis can make comparisons to what the Nazis do. And those are totally off. I mean, like they're not, I don't even know what you would use to, there's nothing you could even say. I can, when I talked about my Palestinian colleague coming and talking about like ghettoization is huge and occupation, and the fact that like you could say, well, Nazi occupation was for a period of time and there was this horrible genocide at the same time that 56 years of occupation, like that alone should get Israeli and Americans and whoever else to make sure that they do not use the language of calling Palestinians Nazis. I don't even know what to say. It's so unfathomable and outrageous. And Mohammed, if you have something that you could, I'm happy to project it out. I don't even know how to respond to that right now. It's so outrageous.
It is outrageous.
Yeah.
So I think we are done with the questions. So I'd like to end with a question of my own. So what do you see as what's your final vision for what is just? So today we're talking about one aspect of this struggle against Zionism. What do you project as the end result where you would say, okay, this is great? Would it be having two states, one for Jews, one for non-Jews? Would it be one democratic state? Would it be something else?
Yeah, I love your question. So I'm going to answer it, of course, more indirectly because that's what I do. But what I want to say, first of all, I mean, the two-state idea is ridiculous. But as I tell my, and sorry if that's offensive to anybody who wants two states, I shouldn't say it that way. For me, As a Sephardic Jew, when I look at my history and I look at the history of how Sephardic Jews lived in the world and Sephardic opposition there was Sephardic opposition. So Jews who were kicked out of Spain, ended up in the Ottoman Empire and all over the Middle East, and ended up in what was modern day, what was Palestine under the Ottoman Empire, and still remains in what became Israel. And those of us who, the Sephardic Jews that didn't end up in Palestine, that there was that opposition to Zionism as being an ethnocratic, a Jewish state alone. That is a very European concept. That idea of being in a place that is not multicultural, multi-faith, multi-ethnic, multi-whatever is the European nation state concept. I mean, and you can see what's happened through colonization that happened to countries, you can see what's happening to Turkey. I mean, this idea of this ethnocratic, this one, rather than being multicultural. And I was just doing a talk to my 11th graders, talking to them about the Islamic empires and then the Ottoman Empire. And yes, there are advantages and disadvantages, but they were so struck by the examples of what was happening in, like for instance, in Salonika and Istanbul and in Jerusalem during the time of the Ottoman Empire. And then when nationalism really took over as the force to be able to define who you are. And that nationalism in its core is really a concept that is about isolating people from one another and creating homogeneity. And I'm not interested in that. And I do feel like my entire, it is a little hard to be in a relationship. I mean, being a Jewish person in this movement, when I'm a minority Jewish person in this movement, and my concepts of how to be are very different. It's hard to explain that and also like really try to build it now. Like it's not just this is useful for an activism moment. I actually am interested in building those relationships now. So why do we have coalitions with, why are there Jewish people who are like Jews of color and also white Jews who are in coalition with people of color and with Palestinians, and that's the world we want to build, and we step on each other's toes also. So when I think about like what would a one state like really actually look like, and I will never forget Palestinian colleague Nora Erekat has talked about this, where she said, if there were two states, once you have that state of Palestine, she would be one of the first people who's working to oppose how Palestine becomes like a nationalist, all the ways that nationalism messes people up. So I think even if we say this ideal, even if I say an ideal is one state where there's, equality for all, there's the idea of the right of return is actually addressed and completed, that there's compensation for the harms that have been done over time, that there's a recognition that everybody in this state is now protected. I don't know how to untangle all the pieces, but I'm absolutely for that kind of justice. And I don't know what that means for me with a state like that. And it's kind of irrelevant for me to have the conversation, other than the fact that I'm Jewish and people constantly tie me to this place. Whereas if you ask what my diaspora is, I would say I actually think it's more like the Isle of Rhodes or, what's modern day Turkey. But I don't get to make those associations. I don't get to have my self-determination the way that I want it. It's being formed for me. So I feel like even saying the one state all of a sudden reties me newly, like I'm trying to like detie myself, but it reties me newly to a region that I long for, to look differently and feel differently and have some of the history at the same time. And this is very much about me. Like you asked it and I'm talking about me, but I'm also trying to think about the issues of justice and then what questions it raises as a result of that. All right, very long-winded answers. Sorry about that.
This is amazing. I really appreciate the way you made it Palestinian-centric. This is how it should be. So thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Actually, so Dr. Iilise Cohen, thank you very much for your time, for your answers, for your thoroughness. and for your compassion and your authenticity. It really shows in what you say and the way you talk. So thank you very much. Thank you for everyone who has attended, and thank you for the Palestine Dialogue Group in Istanbul for making this possible.
And can I just say one more thing? If anybody has any questions, suggestions, thoughts, or whatever, please, please encourage folks to get in touch with me. I'm really, I'm absolute open book, and I also need people to feed, feed me,
Would
be
you
able to
type
think.
would you type your email address or however you want us to contact you in the chat?
Sure. And then I'll also give, there we go.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
You too. Bye-bye.